The train groaned into Dry Creek Station like a promise already broken. August heat wrapped around the platform, thick and mean. She stepped down last. Too tall for the low door, too tall for the stairs already crawling up her frame. A gray dress, a carpet bag. A letter clutched tight from too many readings. By the black carriage, the man in the fine suit turned. His eyes found her face, then kept traveling. The smile he had ready cracked and died. A low laugh from the crowd. A boy pointed. The word landed anyway. Giant the man pulled bills from his vest, counted them fast, held them out. Take the money, he said, voice carrying. Go home. She looked at the money. Then at him, straightened another inch. The boards under her boots protested. The platform went quiet, waiting to see what she would do. The train didn't so much arrive as surrender. It groaned into Dry Creek Station like something that had given up halfway. Steam hissing out the sides like a sigh nobody asked for. August 1882. The kind of heat that sits on your shoulders like a hand pressing down. And there she was, Cora Hendricks. 23 years old. Stepping down from that passenger car like the whole platform had been built a size too small for her because it had been. She ducked under the doorframe out of habit. Always had to duck. Boston doorways, Chicago doorways, this doorway. Didn't matter. The world kept building for smaller people, and Cora kept folding herself to fit. Except today she wasn't folding. Today she was standing on a wooden platform in Wyoming territory, with a carpet bag in one hand and a letter in the other, and that letter said a man named Silas Crowder wanted her. Wanted her enough to pay her fare. Wanted her enough to write 3 pages about cattle and acreage, and the fine house waiting for a woman's touch. She'd read it 40 times on the train, maybe 50, until the paper went soft as cloth. Her dress was gray. Practical gray, the kind that doesn't show dust, because she'd learned a long time ago that dust finds you, no matter what color you wear, so you might as well wear the color that hides it. Her hair was pinned up, though pins never lasted long against her. Nothing small ever lasted long against her. She was the tallest person on that platform, taller than most of the men. And she felt it, felt every inch of it, felt the way the crowd's eyes climbed up her like she was a building they were trying to measure. A child near the luggage cart pointed, said something to his mother. The mother yanked his hand down fast, but not fast enough, because Cora had already heard the word. Giant she'd heard it before, heard it in Ohio, heard it Gouliard when she was 9, and already taller than the teacher. Heard it from boys who thought it was clever. Heard it from women who thought it was pity. Heard it from her own father once, late at night, when he didn't know she was listening, when he said to no one in particular, "What man's gonna want a girl built like that?" She'd carried that sentence for 14 years. She set her jaw, scanned the platform, looking for him. Silas Crowder had sent a photograph. Tall man, confident smile, standing in front of a house too grand to be modest about. She'd memorized that face the same way she'd memorized the letter. They're near the black carriage. Sandy hair. Mustache waxed sharp enough to cut something. Suit that cost more than her father had made in a year of milking other men's cows. He was looking past her, matching the crowd the way a man searches for something he's excited about. She lifted her chin, walked toward him, each step landing harder than she meant it to, the platform boards creaking under her boots, because that's what happened. Boards creaked, doors needed ducking, chairs needed checking before she sat. The whole world built to remind her, she didn't fit it, Mr. Crowder. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He turned, and here it was. The moment she'd been bracing for the entire journey west. The moment she'd rehearsed 100 ways in her head. Hoping, maybe this time, maybe this one time, the bracing wouldn't be necessary. It was necessary. His eyes found her face first, then traveled down, then kept traveling, because she kept going, 5 inches past where most women stopped, and his expression did the thing she'd seen 1,000 times. It broke, not slowly, all at once. Like a dropped plate, he stopped, started again.
You're Cora Hendricks?
Yes, sir. The Cora Hendricks who wrote me, the very same. He looked at the letter in her hand like it might explain itself, like it might apologize on her behalf. Your photograph, he said. It showed a woman of... He didn't finish. Didn't have to, because the crowd was already slowing down around them, already sensing the way a crowd senses these things, the way dogs sense storms. Something happening, something worth stopping for. The photograph was accurate, Mr. Crowder. Accurate. He laughed. Sharp, ugly, Miss Hendricks. There is nothing accurate about a photograph that fails to mention you'd block out the sun. Somewhere behind her, a woman gasped. Somewhere else, a man laughed, low, the kind of laugh men do when they think no one's counting it against them. Cora felt her face go hot, felt it climb up her neck like something alive. I assure you, she said, my size has never once stopped me from a full day's work. Work isn't the issue. Silas stepped back, actually stepped back, like distance might fix what his eyes had already seen. I asked for a wife, Miss Hendricks. Not a... He stopped himself again, but the crowd finished it for him in their heads. She could see it happening on their faces. Could see the word forming behind a dozen pairs of eyes, even though nobody said it out loud. Ox mule giant. Not a what, Mr. Crowder? Because she needed him to say it. Needed it dragged out into the open air where everyone could see exactly what kind of man he was instead of letting it hide behind his teeth. He didn't say it. He was smarter than that, at least. Cruel, but smart. This won't do, he said instead, turning to his driver. Garrett, the ladies' return fare. See to it, the driver. Older man, weathered face, hat pulled low, didn't move right away. Garrett, yes sir, still didn't move. Silas reached into his vest, pulled out a leather billfold. Counted bills like he was paying for spoiled meat. Here, he held it out to her, not even looking at her now. Looking somewhere over her shoulder, like she'd already become something he didn't have to see anymore. Train east leaves tomorrow morning. There's a boarding house on 2nd Street. Cora stared at the money. Stared at it the way you stare at a door that's just been shut in your face. That half second where your body hasn't caught up to what your eyes already know. Take it some small. Tired. 14 years of this already voice in her said, take it, Cora, take it and go. Because this is what happens. This is what always happens. You knew this would happen before you even got on that train, except her mother used to say something before the fever took her. Said it with her last good breath, hand cold in Cora's hand, voice so quiet Cora had to lean in to catch it. Don't let them measure you in their inches. Cora girl, you measure yourself. No, Cora said. Silas blinked. I beg your pardon? I said no. The crowd's murmuring sharpened into something closer to silence. The good kind of silence. The kind that means everyone's leaning in without meaning to. You invited me here, Mr. Crowder. You sent the fare. You wrote me 3 pages about wanting a partner. I wanted a wife. You wanted a decoration. Her voice didn't shake. She made sure of that. Pressed it flat and steady, like ironing a shirt. Something small enough to fit on your arm at church so the other ranchers could admire your good fortune. His face went red. You don't know anything about what I wanted. I know exactly what you wanted, sir. I've spent my whole life being exactly what men like you don't want. I recognize the look on your face. I've seen it since I was 9 years old. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman made a small sound. Could have been sympathy. Could have been scandal. Hard to tell which, out here, where the two often sounded the same. Silas thrust the bills toward her again. Take the money, Miss Hendricks. Go home. This is my home now. She lifted her chin another inch, which put her eyes nearly level with his hat brim. Or it's about to be. With or without you. You won't last a week out here, funny. She picked up her bag. I've heard that sentence in 3 different states now. And here I still am. She turned, walked. Didn't know where. Didn't have a plan past not standing there one more second under all those eyes. All that pity, dressed up as curiosity. All those whispers that would follow her down Main Street, whether she liked it or not, behind her. Silas called out, voice pitched loud enough to make sure the whole platform heard it. This territory eats people like you for breakfast. Miss Hendricks. She didn't turn around, didn't trust her face not to crack if she did. She'd made it maybe 40 yards, maybe 50. Heart still slamming, hands still shaking around the handle of her bag, though she'd have died before letting anyone see that part. Miss a voice. Different from Silas's. Older, rougher around the edges, like a fence post left out too many winters. She turned the driver, Garrett. Hat still in his hands instead of on his head, which struck her as odd. A small thing, but odd, ma'am. I'm sorry for what happened back there. You've got nothing to apologize for, Mr. Garrett. Just Garrett. You've got nothing to apologize for, Garrett. You didn't say a word of it. No, he looked down at his hat, turned it once in his hands. But I drove the carriage that brought him there to say it. Feels like I oughta apologize for something. She studied him. Older man. 60, maybe. Hands like old leather, the kind that had pulled rope and gripped reins for 40 years straight. You looking for work, Miss Hendricks? I'm looking for a reason not to get back on that train tomorrow morning. Might be I can help with both. He glanced back toward the station, toward Silas, who was climbing into his fine black carriage like nothing had happened at all, like he hadn't just humiliated a woman in front of half the county. There's a man, Garrett said, lowering his voice. Name's Nathaniel Holt, runs a small spread about 10 miles north. Good man, fair man, needs hands real bad this season, and he won't care a lick how tall you stand, long as you can work. And why'd you send me to him? You work for Crowder. Garrett's jaw tightened. Because Nate Holt's daddy pulled me out of the Sweetwater when I was 22 and the current had already taken my horse and half my good sense. I've been paying that back in small ways ever since. Sending a hard worker his direction, he shrugged, like that settled it. Seems like a fair installment. Cora looked down the road. North, he'd said. Toward mountains she could just make out. Blue-gray against a sky too bright to look at straight on. He won't laugh at me? It came out smaller than she meant it to, smaller than she wanted any part of herself to sound ever again after today. Garrett's face softened. Ma'am, I can't promise the whole territory won't have opinions about a woman your size. Folks out here got opinions about everything, weather included. But Nate Holt? He judges a person by what they can lift, not how tall they stand to lift it. She thought of the bills still sitting somewhere on that platform, probably already swept up by some boy hoping for a reward. Thought of the boarding house. Thought of tomorrow's eastbound train. Thought of her mother's voice. You measure yourself. All right, Cora said. Take me to him. The road north was long and quiet, and Cora was grateful for both. Garrett didn't push conversation. Just let the wagon rattle along. Let the prairie unfold in every direction like something that had never once considered an edge. Cora had never seen sky like this. Boston's sky came in patches, framed by rooftops and chimney smoke. This sky came in everything. Pressed down on the land like it owned it. It's a lot of nothing, Garrett said, noticing her looking. It's not nothing. She kept her eyes on the horizon. It's just not finished being decided yet. He glanced at her sideways. Something like a smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. Nate'll like that one. You think he'll like anything about me? I think Nate Holt stopped caring what other folks think a long while back. Made it easier on him. Why's that? Garrett didn't answer right away. Flicked the reins. Watched the road. That's his story to tell, ma'am. Not mine. She let it sit. Didn't push. She knew what it was. Carrying a story too heavy to hand off to a stranger on a wagon ride. She had a few of her own. By the time they crested the last rise, the sun was sliding low, painting everything gold and a little unreal. Below them sat a modest spread. A house sturdy but plain. A barn that had clearly seen some hard winters and survived them stubbornly. Corrals. A scattering of cattle moving slow across a pasture that ran out toward the mountains like it had somewhere to be. Nothing fancy. Nothing like Crowder's place, she'd bet. And somehow, looking at it, something in her chest unclenched for the first time since stepping off that train. Not relief exactly, just the particular quiet of a held breath. Finally finding somewhere safe to land, a man was working near the barn. Even from this distance she could tell. Tall, not as tall as her, but solid through the shoulders in a way that spoke of years doing things with his hands instead of his money. He moved with a small, steady limp, favoring his left leg just slightly, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking. Cora was looking. She noticed things like that now. Had to. People noticed her first. She'd learned to notice everyone else faster, sharper, before they decided what to make of her. Garrett pulled the wagon up near the fence, and the man turned, wiping his hands on a rag, squinting up at them against the dying sun. Garrett, his voice was low, even. Didn't expect you out this way. Brought you somebody, Nate. The man's eyes moved to Cora, and here it was again. The moment she braced for it without meaning to. Felt her spine go rigid, felt her chin lift on its own, an old reflex worn smooth from repetition. Here it comes, here it comes. Except it didn't. His eyes traveled up, stopped at her face, stayed there. That was all, no widening, no flinch. No half-step back like the platform had been full of. Like Silas had done, so dramatically. You'd think she'd grown a second head right in front of him, just a man looking at another person's face. The way you're supposed to. Ma'am, he said. Simple. Like a greeting he'd give anybody, Mr. Holt. Garrett tells me you're looking for work. I am. You got experience with livestock? Some. Dairy farm, back in Ohio. Cattle's different, I expect. But I learned fast. Hard work doesn't scare you? Sir, hard work is the only kind of work anyone's ever offered me. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile. Closer to recognition. Pays fair, not generous, he said. Cabin's small, but it's dry and it's yours alone. Meals at the house, mornings and evenings. That's more than I had an hour ago. He nodded slowly, like that settled something for him. Why's a woman like you need to ride 10 miles north looking for ranch work? And there it was, the question underneath the question. She could hear it plain as anything. What happened back there? What did he say? Why are you not on that man's arm tonight? Eating dinner in his fine house. She decided, right then, she wasn't going to dress it up. Mr. Crowder took one look at me and decided I was too big to be a wife. Sent me back with train fare and an insult. Nate's jaw tightened, just slightly. Just enough that she caught it. He say that to your face? In front of half the county. A long pause. The wind picked up, pushing the grass into long silver waves across the pasture. Man's a fool, Nate said, finally. 2 words, that was all. But something in Cora's chest cracked open a little at that. In a way she hadn't expected, didn't entirely yet. Because 2 words wasn't a rescue, wasn't a promise, wasn't anything but a man stating a fact the way you'd state the weather. And somehow that mattered more than anything. Silas Crowder could have said with 3 pages of fine penmanship. You start tomorrow, Nate said. 5 in the morning. Cattle don't care what time you'd prefer. I would expect them to. Garrett, you mind helping her get settled in the cabin? I've got chores need finishing before dark. Not at all. Nate nodded once, turned back toward the barn, then stopped. Looked back at her. Miss Hendricks, yes? Whatever he told you about yourself back there. He paused. Like he was choosing the words carefully, the way you'd choose footing on uneven ground. He was measuring you with the wrong instrument is all. Don't mean the measurement was true. He walked off before she could answer. Which was good, because she didn't trust her voice not to break if she'd tried. The cabin was small. 1 room. A stove, a narrow bed that she suspected would be a half-foot too short for her. The second she lay down in it, a table, 2 chairs. It was also clean. And it was hers. Garrett helped her carry her bag inside. Then lingered in the doorway a moment, hat back in his hands. He's a good man, Garrett said. Quiet. Don't talk much about himself. But good. What happened to his leg? Garrett's face shifted, something careful crossing it. That's his to tell, you said that already. About the other thing, too. Some men got more than one story they're not ready to hand out, ma'am. She thought about that. Thought about her own stories. The schoolyard, her father's voice in the dark, 14 years of bracing for impact that had finally today stopped landing exactly the way it always had. Fair enough, she said. Garrett tipped his hat. Welcome to Wyoming, Miss Hendricks. Rough start. Might be a decent finish, though, if you let it. He left her there. Alone in the small cabin, with the light going gold and then gray outside the single window, with the sound of cattle calling somewhere out in the dark, and the wind moving through grass that had nowhere particular to stop, she lay down. Boots still on, too tired to fight with the laces. Her feet hung off the end of the bed. Of course they did. She almost laughed. A short, surprised sound, half exhausted, half something else. Something that had been clenched tight in her chest since the platform, and was only now starting to let go. Too small a bed. Too small a doorway. Too small a world, still, in most of the places that mattered. But not here. Not tonight. Tonight, there'd been a man who looked at her face and stopped there, who'd said 2 words about Silas Crowder that weighed more than anything. Silas himself had managed in 3 pages of letters. Fool, he'd said. Cora pulled the thin blanket up over herself, feet still hanging in the cool night air, and for the first time since stepping off that train, she let herself believe. Just a little, just enough to risk it, that maybe this place wouldn't ask her to fold herself smaller. Maybe, for once, she could just stand. 5 in the morning came hard and fast, the rooster outside the cabin, announcing it like an argument he intended to win. Cora was up before he finished crowing. Pulled on the clothes she'd brought, too fitted in some places, too short in the sleeves, made for a smaller frame than the one she carried, and stepped out into a cold so sharp it cleared her head in one breath. Nate was already at the barn. Of course he was. "Morning," he said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "Morning, eaten?" "Not yet. There's coffee in the house. Eggs, if you want to make them. We eat quick out here. Work doesn't wait on a full stomach." She found her way to the kitchen. Found the stove had its own opinions about heat, the way every stove she'd ever met seemed to. Running too hot, then sulking too cold. And she fought it to something like compromise by the time the eggs were done. Nate ate, standing, leaning against the counter, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not suspicion. Not curiosity exactly either. Something closer to waiting. Like he was giving her room to prove something, or to fail at it, and either way, he wasn't going to rush the verdict. "First thing," he said, setting down his cup. "You need to meet the horses. Can't work animals that don't trust you yet." The barn smelled like hay and warm hide and old wood, and the horse he led her to, a big gray gelding with a white blaze, eyed her the way most things eyed her first, sizing her up. "This is Samson," Nate said. "Don't let the name fool you. He's gentle as they come, long as you don't come at him scared." "I'm not scared, didn't say you were. Said don't come at him that way." Horses know the difference between a person and a person pretending. She reached out her hand the way he showed her, slow, palm flat. Samson huffed against her fingers. Stamped once, then settled. "There," Nate said. "He likes you fine. How can you tell?" "He didn't bite you," the faintest curl at the corner of his mouth. That's about as high a compliment as Samson gives anybody. The morning unspooled slow and hard, mucking stalls, hauling water buckets that strained even her considerable arms, learning the names of tools she'd never held before. By mid-morning, her shoulders ached in places she hadn't known could ache, and her hands, already calloused from years of farm work, were finding new blisters in new places. Nate worked beside her the whole time. Didn't hover, didn't correct every small mistake, just showed her once, plainly, and let her find her own way through the rest. "You don't talk much," she said, around noon, both of them resting in what shade the barn offered. "Don't have much I need to say." Garrett said, "You've got a story or two you're not handing out." His expression closed just slightly. Like a door pulled to, not slammed. Garrett talks too much for a man who claims to be quiet. He didn't say what it was, just that there was one. Nate was quiet a long moment. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. "I was a soldier," he said finally. "Frontier service. Took a bad fall off a horse during a skirmish near the Powder River. 6 years back. Leg never set right," he flexed it slightly, like checking it was still there. "Army didn't have much use for a cavalryman who couldn't sit a horse proper for long stretches, so they thanked me for my service and sent me home. That why you limp. That's why I limp. People give you trouble over it?" Something flickered across his face. "Quick. Gone almost as soon as it arrived. Some men in town used to call me half a soldier. Like the rest of me didn't count for nothing. Once the leg went bad," he shrugged. But it wasn't as easy a shrug as he probably meant it to look. "Learned a man can get used to being looked at sideways. Learned it don't have to break him, neither, if he decides it won't." Cora sat with that. felt something in her, recognized something in him, not pity. Closer to kinship. That's why you didn't flinch, she said quietly. Yesterday, when you saw me, he looked at her then. Really looked. The way he had the evening before. Eyes staying steady on her face, instead of sliding away or down or anywhere else. Figured a person's worth showed up in their hands and their grit, he said. Not in how much room they take up standing still. She didn't have an answer for that, didn't trust herself to find words sturdy enough to hold it. So she just nodded and picked the pitchfork back up and got back to work because that was the one language she'd always trusted more than any other. The language of hands moving, of effort given honestly, of proving something not through speeches but through showing up, again and again, until showing up became its own kind of truth. The afternoon brought cattle, real cattle. Not the docile dairy cows of Ohio, but rangy, half-willed creatures with horns that looked like they meant business, and eyes that watched her the way the whole territory seemed to be watching her, weighing, deciding, waiting to see if she'd hold. Never run from one. Nate told her, the two of them standing at the corral fence. Running tells them you're prey. Stand your ground. Make yourself big. I'm already big. The smallest laugh escaped him. Surprised, like he hadn't planned on it. Then you've got an advantage most folks don't. A young steer broke from the cluster and charged the fence where she stood, and every instinct in her screamed to step back, to fold herself smaller the way she'd folded for 14 years, except she didn't. She planted her boots, squared her shoulders, made herself, for the first time in her whole life, glad to take up exactly as much space as she did. The steer stopped short of the fence, snorted, pawed the dirt once, then ambled back toward the herd like nothing had happened at all. Good, Nate said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard from him yet. Something like approval, quiet and real. You might just make a rancher yet, Miss Hendricks. Cora. He glanced over. You can call me Cora, she said. If we're going to be standing at fences, together making ourselves big, seems like we ought to be on a first-name basis. Something warmed in his expression. Just barely. Just enough, Cora, he said, testing the shape of it. All right. Then, Nate, the sun was dropping low by the time they finished, painting the whole pasture the color of old copper, and Cora's body ached in ways it had never ached before. A deep, honest tiredness that felt, strangely, like something to be proud of, rather than ashamed. She thought of the train platform. Thought of Silas Crowder's face, breaking like a dropped plate. Thought of his voice carrying across the crowd. This territory eats people like you for breakfast. Maybe it would, eventually. Territories were hard, and this one hadn't shown her its sharpest edges yet, she was sure of that. But tonight, walking back toward her small cabin, with her hands raw and her shoulders sore, and a man beside her who'd looked at her face instead of measuring her against some shrinking idea of what a woman should be. Tonight, Cora Hendricks didn't feel eaten. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, exactly the right size. She didn't know it yet, walking back toward that small cabin with the skies going purple behind the mountains. But word of what happened at the station had already outpaced her into town, into the general store, into the church pews and the kitchen tables of Dry Creek, where it was already being told and retold and reshaped into something crueler with each telling. Silas Crowder, for his part, had not let the matter rest quietly. He stood that evening at the rail of his largest corral, watching his hired men finish the evening feed, a tumbler of whiskey forgotten on the fence post beside him. 3 times the size of Nate Holt's spread, this place. Built by his father, expanded by Silas himself, the kind of land a man was supposed to be able to stand on and feel like something. He didn't feel like something tonight. A laughingstock. That was the word ringing in his ears. He'd heard it muttered behind him as he climbed back into his carriage. Heard it again at the bank that afternoon, 2 men going quiet, the moment he walked in. The particular silence of men who'd just been talking about you. He was not a man accustomed to being laughed at, and somewhere in that wounded pride, something uglier than embarrassment was beginning to take root. Because the woman hadn't slunk away, hadn't taken his money and his insult, and disappeared east the way she was supposed to. She'd refused, she'd found work. Found it fast. Found it nearby. Found it with Nathaniel Holt of all people. A man whose father Silas's own father had once, years back, tried to buy out of his land and failed. Silas picked the whiskey back up. Didn't drink it, just held it, watching the last light die over land that stretched in every direction, exactly as far as he wanted it to. If the woman wanted to stay in his territory, wanted to make him look the fool in front of the whole county, wanted to go work for a half-crippled rancher on a spread that should have been Crowder land 20 years ago, well, that was a problem he intended to correct. He just hadn't decided yet how far he was willing to go to correct it. 3 weeks in, and Cora's hands had stopped bleeding. That was the marker she used now. Not days, not calendar pages. Just her hands, split open the first week, scabbed the second, and now the third. Finally just rough. Just hardened. Just hers. She liked that better than counting days. Because counting days meant counting how long since the train station. Since Silas Crowder's voice cracking across that platform like a whip. Since the word giant landed on her like a brand. She didn't want that number in her head anymore. So she counted calluses instead. "You're getting faster," Nate said one morning, watching her swing the axe through a stubborn round of cottonwood. One strike. Clean split. She didn't even have to reset her stance anymore. Getting faster at chopping wood, she wiped her brow with her forearm. "Should put that on my gravestone. Better than what most folks get put on theirs. Such as nothing. Most folks don't get good at anything worth writing down. It wasn't much. Just a sentence." But Cora found herself turning it over in her head the rest of the morning. The way you turn over a stone that might have something underneath it. Because that was Nate's way. Small sentences, plain words. Nothing dressed up, nothing wasted. And somehow those small sentences had started landing harder than anything Silas Crowder had ever written in 3 pages of fine penmanship. She didn't examine that thought too closely, didn't trust herself to. Tonderkin word had spread through Dry Creek like grease fire, through dry grass, the giant woman. Crowder's reject. Working Holt spread now, if you can believe it. Martha Calloway, who ran the general store and had opinions sharper than her scissors, heard it 3 separate times before noon on a Tuesday, and by the 4th telling, she'd had quite enough of hearing it secondhand. "You're the one," Martha said, the first time Cora walked through her door. No greeting, no preamble, just a flat statement, delivered the way you'd announce weather. "I suppose I am. The one Crowder sent back with train fare." "That's the one." Martha looked her up and down. Slow, thorough. The kind of look Cora had spent her whole life bracing against, except Martha's eyes didn't stop at her shoulders the way most people's did. Didn't widen. Didn't flinch. They just kept moving. "Assessing. The way you'd size up a good plow horse. You eat much?" Martha asked. "Pardon? Big as you are. Figure you eat like 2 men. Cora felt heat climb her neck. Old reflex. Old shame. Dressed up and ready to answer the door before she'd even decided to let it in. Except something in Martha's voice wasn't cruel. Wasn't even curious in the gossiping way. It was practical. The way a woman asks about feed costs. "I eat what the work requires," Cora said carefully. Martha grunted. Something that might have been approval. Good. Hate women who starve themselves down to nothing trying to look delicate. Never did see the use of delicate out here. Delicate doesn't pull a calf out backwards in a snowstorm. "No," Cora said slowly. "I don't suppose it does. You doctored a calf yet? Out at Holt's place?" "Not yet. You will. Nate's herd always finds a reason to need doctoring right around first frost." Martha turned back to her counter. Already done with the conversation, already moving on to the next thing. "Tell him I've got the liniment he likes, and tell him." She stopped. Looked back at Cora with something almost like a smirk. "Tell him Crowder came in here Monday asking after you." Cora's stomach dropped. "Asking what?" "Asking where you'd landed. Asking if Holt had taken you on." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. "Didn't like my answer much." "What did you tell him?" "Told him it wasn't his business anymore, what you did with yourself. Seeing as he'd thrown that privilege away on a train platform in front of half the county. Something eased in Cora's chest, quiet and small. The kind of relief that doesn't announce itself. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." Martha waved a hand, already counting out flour for another customer. "Thank your own backbone. I just enjoy watching a man like Crowder choke on his own pride. Free entertainment, that is." Silas Crowder did not enjoy choking on his pride. That same Monday evening, he rode out alone to the boundary line his father had marked decades back, a low ridge where Crowder land met the open range that bordered 3 other spreads, including Holt's. He sat his horse there a long while, looking out over land he'd known his whole life, trying to remember why none of it felt like enough tonight. Because his mind kept circling back to the same useless loop. She's working for Holt. She's working for Holt of all people. She refused my money, and she's out there right now, mucking stalls for a half-crippled rancher, and somehow that's supposed to sit easy with me. Except it didn't sit easy. It sat like a stone in his boot. Small, sharp, impossible to ignore no matter how many times he told himself it shouldn't matter. He rode back to the house after dark, found Garrett waiting near the stable. The way he always was, dependable as the sunrise. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Crowder?" "I did." Silas dismounted slowly, handed off the reins. "I understand you're the one who drove Miss Hendricks north. To the Holt place." A pause. Half a second too long. "Yes, sir. Why?" "She needed work. He needed hands." Seemed a fair match, did it? Silas studied his foreman the way he'd study a horse he suspected of lameness. "Curious, Garrett. You've worked for me 11 years. Never once known you to play matchmaker for a stranger off the train." Garrett's jaw tightened, just barely. "Wasn't matchmaking, sir. Was common decency. Common decency." Silas turned the words over like they tasted strange. "And here I thought common decency was staying loyal to the man who pays your wages. Don't see how the two conflict, no?" Silas walked toward the house, voice carrying back over his shoulder. "I'll tell you what I see, Garrett. I see a woman who humiliated me in front of half this county. I see her landing conveniently with a man whose family has been a thorn in mine for 2 generations. And I see my own foreman driving the wagon that put her there. Wasn't my intention to embarrass you, sir. Wasn't your intention." Silas stopped on the porch step, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. "Intentions don't matter much, Garrett, when the result is the whole territory laughing behind my back." Garrett said nothing. "You're still loyal to old debts," Silas said. "I know about the river. Know what Holt's father did for you all those years back. But I'd remind you whose name is on your pay. Won't forget it, sir. See that you don't." Garrett led the horse away, and Silas stood on that porch a long while, watching the dark settle over land he was already quietly beginning to think about reclaiming. Not the Holt land specifically. Not yet. But the water rights that ran through both properties, shared by an agreement his own father had signed decades back, an agreement Silas had never much liked the terms of, an agreement that could, perhaps, with the right legal pressure, be revisited. He went inside, poured himself a whiskey at his desk this time, the ledgers spread out before him, and began, with a cold and careful patience, to plan. The trouble started small, it always did. Cora was learning. Out here, disasters didn't announce themselves with thunder. They crept in sideways, dressed up as inconveniences, until you looked back and realized the inconveniences had been a pattern all along. First, it was the water. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Nate's property, shared by old agreement with Crowder's land upstream, slowed to half its normal flow one morning in early October. Nate stood at the bank, jaw tight, watching water that should have been knee-deep barely cover his boots. "Drought?" Cora asked. "No drought." His voice was flat, controlled in the way that told her it was costing him something to keep it that way. "Somebody's diverting it. Upstream, Crowder. Can't prove it. Don't need to prove it. We both know." Nate didn't answer. Just stood there, watching the water that wasn't coming. And Cora watched him not answer. And something in her twisted at the sight of it. This man who'd looked at her without flinching, who'd called Silas a fool in 2 flat words, now standing helpless at the edge of his own creek. "What do we do?" she asked. She heard herself say it. hadn't planned to. The word had just slipped out, easy as breathing, like it belonged there. Nate glanced at her. Something flickered across his face. We, he repeated, testing the word the way he'd tested her first name, weeks back. Unless you'd rather he said you. No. Something almost like a smile, gone as fast as it came. We's fine. Then came the cattle buyers. 3 of them, men who'd bought from Nate every season for years, who suddenly found reasons not to this year. Schedules too full. Herds already committed elsewhere. Apologies offered with eyes that wouldn't quite meet his. It's him, Nate said, after the 3rd one rode off without making an offer. Crowders leaned on every buyer within 40 miles. Then we find buyers outside the 40 miles. He looked at her. That's not how it's done out here. And maybe it's time something got done different. Because Cora wasn't going to sit in that small cabin and watch this man's livelihood get strangled by a man too proud to admit he'd lost something at a train station 3 weeks back. Wasn't going to let her own presence here become the reason Nate Holt lost his ranch, so she made a list, every town within 2 days' ride. Every railhead. Every buyer she could think to ask Martha Calloway about. Because Martha, it turned out, knew everyone's business within 100 miles and was perfectly willing to share it for the price of good gossip in return. You're not from here, Martha said, watching Cora write names in a battered notebook. Why do you care so much about Holt's cattle prices? Cora's pen paused. Because he gave me work when nobody else would. That all? That's all that matters right now. Martha's eyebrow lifted, but she let it go. Just handed over 3 more and a warning about a buyer in Casper who watered down his offers, same as he watered down his whiskey. It took 2 weeks of writing, 2 weeks of Cora presenting herself to strangers in town after town. A woman built bigger than most men, speaking on behalf of a rancher who couldn't always make the trip himself, his leg paining him worse in the cold. The first buyer laughed at her, actually laughed. Right in her face, in a feed store in Casper, looked her up and down and said something about Holt sending his wife to do a man's negotiating. I'm not his wife, she said, voiced level. I'm his hired hand. And I know his herd better than any man you'd rather be talking to right now. Because I've worked every head of it myself. The man's laugh died slow. You know cattle? I know which of his heifers will calve easy come spring, and which ones will need watching. I know his beef weight per head better than the scale does. You want to do business, you can do it with me. Or you can ride 40 miles back empty-handed and be slow on your own boss. Why you passed on good stock? Because the person offering it stood taller than you expected. The buyer bought not generously, but fairly. It was a start. By the 2nd week of November, Cora had secured 3 new buyers. Most of what Crowder's pressure had cost them, and Nate stood in the kitchen one evening, going over the numbers she'd brought back, and something in his face had shifted. Not quite disbelief, something closer to a man, recalculating everything. He thought he understood about the woman, sleeping in the cabin out back. You did this, he said. Not a question. We did this. No, he set down the ledger, looked at her straight on the way he had that first evening at the corral. You did this, Cora. Rode 2 weeks in November cold. Talked your way past men who didn't want to listen. Brought back enough business to keep this place standing through winter. Somebody had to. Somebody didn't have to be you. She didn't have an answer for that. Felt the silence stretch. Felt something unfamiliar rise in her, warm and a little frightening. The kind of feeling she'd spent years training herself not to trust. Because trusting it had only ever led to bigger falls. Until Nate reached across the table, just briefly. Just his hand settling over hers for half a second, rough palm against rough knuckles. Gone again, before she could fully register it had happened at all. Thank you, he said. Quiet. She watched his thumb brush, once across her knuckles, before he pulled back, like he hadn't quite decided to do it, and only realized after neither of them said anything more about it. Didn't need to. The storm came 2 nights later. No warning beyond a sky that turned the wrong color too fast, and a wind that shifted hard out of the north, and Nate standing at the window with his jaw set, watching clouds pile up over the mountains like something deciding whether to be merciful. Storm peak, he said. When clouds stack like that, we've got maybe 2 hours. 2 hours for what? To get the herd into the lower pasture. Anything left exposed up top, this storm will kill by morning. But Nate's leg had been paining him worse than usual all week. The cold working into the old break, the way cold always seemed to find old wounds. And Cora watched him try to mount up too fast and wince hard enough that his whole face went white. "You can't ride like that," she said. "Don't have a choice." "You do. I'll go, Cora. I've moved cattle with you a dozen times now. I know the route. I know the herd." She was already swinging up onto Samson, the big gray gelding who'd long since decided she belonged to him. "You'll slow us both down trying to keep up on that leg, and we don't have time to argue about pride right now." Nate stared at her. For one long second, she thought he'd refuse. Thought the same stubborn male pride that lived in every rancher she'd ever met would win out over good sense. "Be careful," he said instead. She held his eyes a moment, surprised by how much weight he'd managed to fit into 2 words, then turned Samson toward the gate before either of them could find more to say. The herd was scattered across the upper pasture, nervy and bunching tight the way cattle do when they smell weather coming, and Cora rode into the wind with her hat pulled low and her heart hammering and absolutely no time to second-guess any of it. 40 head, maybe more. 1 woman, 1 horse. 1 closing window of 2 hours that felt with every passing minute like it was shrinking faster than promised. "All right, Samson," she said into the wind. "You know this better than I do. Show me." The gelding seemed to, cutting toward a steer trying to break wide, anticipating its move before Cora even registered the animal had shifted. She yelled, waved her hat, made herself big the way Nate had taught her that first week, and the herd, slowly, reluctantly, began to move. The first fat drops of rain hit as she crested the last rise toward the lower pasture gate. Then the sky opened entirely. She could barely see. Rain coming sideways now, the wind screaming through the grass, and 1 stubborn old cow planted itself directly in the gateway. Like it had personally decided, this was the hill it would die on. "Move!" Cora shouted, voice tearing against the wind. "I didn't ride 2 weeks, across half this territory, to lose you to plain stubbornness." She dismounted, threw her whole considerable weight against the animal's flank, mud sucking at her boots, rain plastering her hair flat against her face, and for 1 terrible second she thought her strength, the very thing the whole county had mocked her for, wouldn't be enough. Then the cow moved, just like that. Like it had simply been waiting to see if she meant it. She got the gate shut behind the last straggler, just as lightning split the sky directly over Storm Peak. And she stood there in the driving rain, soaked through, shaking with cold and adrenaline both, and laughed, actually laughed, out loud. Into the storm because she'd done it, because the body that had been called too big, too much, too everything her whole life had just single-handedly saved 40 head of cattle from a storm that would have killed them by morning. Nate was waiting at the barn when she rode back in, lantern in hand, despite his bad leg insisting he should be resting it. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her, soaked mud to her elbows, hair plastered flat, grinning like a fool, despite the cold cutting, straight through her clothes. And something in his expression cracked open in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "You got them all in," he said, voice rough. "Every last one." "Cora." He stopped, scarred again. "I thought." He shook his head like he was trying to shake loose something he didn't quite want to say. "Storm like that. A person could have been hurt out there. Could have been worse than hurt. I wasn't, I know that now. Didn't know it. 2 hours ago, standing here, watching that sky, and not being able to do damn thing about it because my own leg wouldn't let me ride out after you." She heard something underneath the words. Something he wasn't saying outright. Something that lived in the careful way he was gripping that lantern, knuckles gone pale. "Nate." "I should get you dry," he said instead, voice suddenly brisk, the moment folding shut as fast as it had opened. "Before you catch your death after all that." But his hand found her elbow as they walked toward the house, stayed there, steady, warm even through soaked fabric, and neither of them said anything more about it. Didn't need to. Word of the storm reached town within 2 days, the way everything seemed to reach town eventually. Carried by some traveling salesman who'd seen the herd safe in Holt's lower pasture, and heard the story secondhand from one of the hands at a neighboring spread. By the time it reached Martha Calloway's store, it had grown considerably. "Heard you rode out alone in that storm," Martha said, the next time Cora came through for supplies. "Heard you moved 40 head by yourself. It wasn't exactly alone." "I had Samson." "Heard the horse gets full credit too then." Martha's mouth twitched. "Heard half the territory's talking about it now. The giant woman who saved Holt's whole herd." Cora's stomach tightened, old reflex rearing up. "They mocking it?" Martha looked at her, surprised. "Mocking it? Girl, half the ranchers in this county couldn't have managed that alone, size or no size. They're not mocking you. They're starting to wonder if Silas Crowder made the worst mistake of his natural life, sending you packing at that station." Something quiet settled over Cora. Not pride exactly. Closer to permission. The strange, late permission to take up the space she'd always taken up without apologizing for it. "It's not the same thing," Cora said quietly. "Being talked about because they're impressed instead of because they're laughing." "No," Martha agreed. "It surely isn't." Silas Crowder heard the story too, heard it from 3 separate sources within a single day, each telling slightly more impressive than the last. Until by evening the story had Cora single-handedly wrestling cattle through a lightning storm with her bare hands. He didn't ride out to the boundary ridge that night. Didn't sit with a whiskey either. Instead, he found himself standing in the empty parlor of his own house. The fine furniture his mother had ordered from Denver years back, arranged exactly as it had always been. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the room felt less like an achievement and more like a museum nobody visited, because the stone in his boot had grown into something larger. Something that kept him standing there well past midnight, turning over a single unwelcome thought. She wasn't supposed to thrive. She was supposed to slink east on that train, supposed to disappear into whatever small, forgettable life a woman like that deserved. And instead, here she was, 3 weeks later, becoming something close to a local legend, while he stood alone in a parlor too big for one man, nursing a bruised reputation and a contested water agreement that wasn't going his way nearly as fast as he'd hoped. He thought of Garrett's careful loyalty to old debts. Thought of 3 cattle buyers who'd taken her business instead of waiting for his pressure to fully take hold. Thought of a woman who simply would not fold the way he'd expected her to fold. By the time he finally went to bed, he'd decided something. If pressure on the water and the buyers wasn't enough to break Nathaniel Holt's resolve or hers, then perhaps it was time to apply pressure somewhere more personal, somewhere that would hurt worse than money. The winter dance came 2 weeks later, held in the church hall the way it was every year, the whole county gathering to push back against the long dark months ahead, with fiddle music and cider, and gossip enough to fuel conversations clear through spring. Cora hadn't planned to go. "You should," Nate said, the week before, in that quiet plain way of his. "Folks ought to see you somewhere besides covered in mud and cattle dust. And what would I wear? I don't exactly fit the dresses most women bring west." Something passed across his face. Thoughtful. Martha might have an idea about that. Martha did have an idea. As it turned out, a length of deep blue fabric she'd been saving for a customer who'd never come to collect it. Fabric that, with 3 evenings of careful alteration, became a dress that actually fit Cora's frame instead of fighting against it. "There," Martha said, pinning the last seam, stepping back to study her work. "Now you'll walk into that hall looking like exactly what you are. And what's that? Someone worth looking twice at. For the right reasons this time." The hall was bright and loud when they arrived. Fiddle music, spilling out into the cold night air, and Cora felt the old reflex rise the moment they stepped through the door. Every head turning, every conversation pausing, the particular silence of a room deciding what to make of someone. Except this silence didn't feel the same as the platform silence. This one had curiosity in it. Even here and there, something like admiration. Well, Martha's voice rang out across the hall before anyone else could decide how to react. About time the woman who saved Holt's whole herd showed her face somewhere besides a cattle pasture. A ripple of laughter. Warm laughter. The good kind. And then, across the room, Silas Crowder set down his cider cup. "Quite the spectacle," he said. Voice pitched to carry, the same way it had carried across the train platform weeks before. "Tell me, Miss Hendricks, does Holt pay you in wages? Or does he simply enjoy having something large enough to do a man's work for a woman's price?" The room went still, genuinely still, this time. The kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks. Cora felt heat climb her neck, old shame reaching for the door before she decided whether to let it in. Except before she could find words, a small voice cut through the silence first. "She's worth 10 of you, Mr. Crowder." Every head turned. A boy. 11 years old, maybe. Thin as a fence rail, standing near the refreshment table with his fists clenched at his sides. Face white, with the particular terror of a child who'd surprised even himself by speaking. Ellie Marsh. The widow Marsh's boy. The one Cora had spent 3 quiet evenings teaching how to stand his ground against the older boys who liked to remind him how small he was. "Excuse me?" Silas's voice had gone cold. "You heard me." Eli's chin lifted. The exact angle Cora had shown him. The exact angle she'd worn herself 100 times. "She taught me not to run from things bigger than me. Taught me standing your ground matters more than how big you are. And you're standing here calling her names because you're scared of something." Scared," Silas repeated, like the word tasted strange in his mouth. "Scared she didn't need you," Eli said. "Scared she's doing just fine without you. That's why you're still talking about her weeks later, instead of forgetting her name like you wanted everybody to think you would." A long, ringing silence. Then, somewhere near the back, someone started clapping, slow at first, then faster. Then the whole room had joined in, and Silas Crowder stood there in the middle of it, face flushing dark red, with absolutely nowhere left to put his anger. He set down his cup, walked out without another word. And Cora stood there, throat tight, watching a skinny 11-year-old boy straighten his shoulders against the weight of every eye in the room, the same way she'd had to learn to do herself, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever kindness she'd given that boy these past weeks had just come back around to protect her in a moment she hadn't seen coming. That was how it worked. Maybe not owed. Not calculated. Just kindness. Moving in a circle, too large to fully see while you were standing inside it. Nate found her outside afterward, the cold sharp and clean after the crowded warmth of the hall. "You all right?" "I think so." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Didn't expect a child to be the one standing up for me tonight. Didn't surprise me much." Nate leaned against the porch rail beside her. "Word in town is you've been teaching that boy something besides arithmetic these past weeks. Just told him size doesn't decide a person's worth. Seemed like something worth telling somebody, before the world tells them different." Nate was quiet a moment. "Somebody should have told you that a long time ago. Somebody did." She looked up at the cold, bright stars, sharper out here than she'd ever seen them back east. "My mother, right before she died, took me most of my life to actually believe her. And now?" She glanced at him. At this quiet, plain-spoken man who'd never once flinched at the size of her, who'd said 2-word sentences that landed harder than anything Silas Crowder had ever managed with all his fine penmanship. "Now," she said slowly. "I'm starting to think she might have been right." Nate didn't say anything. But his hand found hers in the dark, fingers lacing through fingers, rough palm against rough palm. And they stood there together at the edge of the lamplight, while inside the fiddle struck up something slow, something that sounded, even from out here, like the beginning of a different kind of story than the one that had started on that train platform weeks before. Behind them, unnoticed in the shadows past the hitching post, Silas Crowder stood watching a long moment before mounting his horse and riding off into the dark. His pride had taken enough hits for one winter, but pride, wounded enough times, had a way of curdling into something far more dangerous than embarrassment. And Silas Crowder was only just beginning to understand exactly how far he was willing to go to make sure the next chapter of this story went differently than the last. 3 weeks after the winter dance, with the worst of the snow still gathering somewhere north of the mountains, but the cold already settling deep into the bones of the land, the fence went down on a Tuesday. Cora found it first. 3 full sections. Posts snapped clean instead of fallen from weather, which told her everything she needed to know before Nate even rode up beside her to confirm it. Weather didn't do this, she said. No. Nate's jaw was tight in the way she'd learned meant he was holding something back. Weather doesn't use an axe. 12 head had wandered through the gap by the time they found it. Wandered onto the strip of open range that bordered Crowder land. The same disputed strip that had been quietly argued over by ranchers for years, never quite settled, never quite worth fighting over, until now. Because now there were Holt cattle grazing where they shouldn't be, and Cora understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, exactly what that meant. He's going to claim trespass, she said. He's going to try. Nate, I know. He swung down off his horse, already moving toward the broken posts, voice clipped tight. I know what he's doing. Doesn't mean I know how to stop it tonight. They worked until dark, gathering the strays back, and even with both of them at it, 2 head went missing entirely, swallowed up by terrain too broad and too dark to search properly. By the time they got back to the house, Cora's hands were shaking. Not from cold, from something closer to fury. He's not going to stop, she said, standing in the kitchen doorway. Mud to her knees, is he? The water, the buyers, now this. He's not going to stop until he's taken something he can't take back. Nate didn't answer right away. Just stood there, looking older than his 29 years in the lamplight, the weight of a fight he hadn't asked for settling visibly across his shoulders. Maybe he won't have to stop, he said finally. Maybe we stop him first. How? Town meeting, Saturday. Land disputes go before the council. Before they go anywhere near a judge's desk out here. He met her eyes. You'd have to stand up in front of half the county and tell them what you know, what you've seen. Doesn't matter how plain the truth is, if nobody's willing to say it out loud. Cora thought of the train platform. Thought of every silence she'd stood inside since, every room that had gone quiet around her, weighing her, measuring her. I've stood in front of a crowd before, she said. I can do it again. Word of the council meeting spread fast the way everything in Dry Creek seemed to spread, and by Saturday morning the church hall was fuller than it had been for the winter dance. Silas Crowder arrived in his finest coat, flanked by 2 ranch hands, who looked considerably less comfortable than he did, and took a seat near the front with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once doubted how a room would side with him. Cora sat beside Nate. Garrett 2 rows back, hat in his hands, Ellie Marsh and his mother near the door, Martha Calloway, arms crossed, already glaring at Silas like she'd decided whose side she was on weeks ago, and saw no reason to be subtle about it now. The council chairman, a tired-looking man named Foster, called the meeting to order. We're here, he said, regarding a dispute over the eastern grazing strip and an incident involving a damaged fence line on the Holt property. An incident, Silas repeated, standing smoothly. Let's call it what it is. Mr. Holt's cattle wandered onto land that's been contested for years. That's not an incident, that's trespass. The fence didn't fall on its own, Nate said. Posts were cut clean. Axe marks, cattle break fences all the time. Holt, storms, age. Are you suggesting someone deliberately? I'm suggesting exactly that. A murmur ran through the room. Silas's smile didn't waver. That's a serious accusation. You have proof? Nate's jaw tightened. Because he didn't. Not the kind that would hold up clean in front of a council chairman, who, everyone in that room knew, owed Silas Crowder more favors than he'd ever admit out loud. This was the moment Cora had been bracing for since Tuesday night. She stood. I found the fence first, she said, voice steady, carrying to the back of the hall the way it had learned to carry these past months. 3 sections. Clean cuts. Not weather damage. Not age. I've mended enough fences these past months to know the difference. And what would you know about it, Silas said, beyond what Mr. Holtz told you to say? I'd know what I saw with my own eyes, Mr. Crowder. Same as I'd know what I heard you say at that train station 4 months ago. Same as I'd know what your foreman's been quietly telling half the county since. About pressure on water rights and cattle buyers he never used to lean on before. Silas's smile finally cracked. This isn't about the fence anymore, is it? He said. This is about you. Still bitter about what happened at that station. I stopped being bitter about that station a long time ago, Mr. Crowder. Cora's voice didn't shake. You're the one who hasn't. The room went very, very still. Excuse me? You've spent 4 months trying to ruin a man's livelihood, Cora said, because his hired hand refused to disappear quietly the way you expected her to. You've cut water flow, pressured buyers, and now somebody's cutting fences in the dark, conveniently on land that's been a sore spot between your families for years. She paused. Let the silence sit. I'd ask the council to consider, plainly, who actually benefits from all of this. Silas's face had gone dark red, the same shade it had turned on that platform months ago. You overstepped, Miss Hendricks. Maybe. She didn't blink. But I'm not wrong, am I? For one long, ringing moment, nobody in that hall moved. Then Garrett stood up, hat still in his hands. Voice quieter than Cora's, but steady all the same. I'll say something, he said, if the council will allow it. Foster nodded, looking grateful for any direction other than the one the room had been heading. I've worked for Mr. Crowder 11 years, Garrett said. Drove that wagon the day Miss Hendricks arrived. Heard everything said on that platform. Heard him call her things no decent man calls a stranger he asked to travel 2,000 miles. He glanced at Silas, something old and tired in his eyes. And these past weeks, I've heard him talking about water rights different than he ever talked about them before. Talking about pressure. About teaching folks a lesson, he swallowed. I think the fence is part of that lesson, sir. I just don't think he expected the lady to be standing in front of this council telling the truth about it, instead of running back east the way he figured she would. Silas stared at his foreman like the floor had opened beneath him. Garrett, I'm sorry, Mr. Crowder. But I owe a debt to the Holt family older than the one I owe you, and I won't keep quiet about cut fences to protect a man's pride when there's livestock and livelihood on the line. The room erupted into murmuring, low and fast at the particular sound of a crowd's opinion shifting all at once, like wind changing direction across a field. Hoopah! Foster banged his gavel. Order. Order, please. When the room quieted, he looked at Silas with an expression that suggested years of quiet deference had just run out. Mr. Crowder, Foster said, in light of testimony, the council will require the eastern strip to remain under joint use as previously agreed, pending a formal survey. And I'd strongly suggest you consider whether further incidents on the Holt property might warrant a different sort of hearing altogether. Silas stood very still. Then, without a word, he gathered his coat and walked out of the hall, the door swinging shut hard behind him. Cora found herself shaking afterward, in the cold outside the church, the adrenaline finally catching up to her now that the moment had passed. You did that, Nate said, coming up beside her. Stood up in front of half the county and said what nobody else would. Garrett did the heavy part. Garrett confirmed what you already had the nerve to say first. Nate studied her, something warm and unguarded in his face that she hadn't seen from him before, not even that night after the storm. I've known plenty of brave men, Cora. Soldiers, ranchers who'd stare down a stampede without blinking. None of them ever stood in a room like that and told the truth, knowing the whole town might side against them anyway. I wasn't trying to be brave, no? I was trying to make sure he didn't get to keep deciding who counts in this territory and who doesn't. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. Spent my whole life being told I took up too much room. I wasn't about to let him decide that for you too. Nate's hand found hers. Didn't let go this time. For what it's worth, he said quietly. You've never taken up too much room in my life, Cora. Not 1 inch of it I'd want back. She looked up at him. At this plain, quiet man who said things in small sentences that somehow weighed more than anything dressed up in fine words ever could. That's possibly the nicest thing anyone's said to me since I got off that train. Possibly? I'm reserving judgment. You've got a habit of topping yourself. Something that might have been a real laugh escaped him. Surprised, warm, gone too fast but real while it lasted. Garrett quit the following Monday. He came to find Cora and Nate himself, riding out to the Holt place in the gray early light before chores, his small bundle of belongings tied behind his saddle. Came to ask if you've got work for an old man, he said, not quite meeting Nate's eyes at first. Garrett. Nate set down the bucket he was carrying. What happened? What happened is, I told the truth in front of that council, and Mr. Crowder doesn't forgive a man for that. Told me yesterday my services were no longer required. Didn't even let me finish out the week, he shrugged, though it cost him something to make it look easy. 11 years. Settled up in about as long as it takes to say it. Cora felt something tighten in her chest. Garrett, that's because of what you said for us, for me, wasn't because of you, ma'am. Was because of me. I'm the one decided 11 years of wages weren't worth keeping quiet about a cut fence. He looked at Nate then. Your daddy pulled me out of that river 38 years back. Never did finish paying that debt the way I wanted to. Figure helping raise this place back up might finally settle the account, if you'll have me. Nate didn't answer right away. Just crossed the yard and shook the old man's hand. The kind of handshake that says, more than most speeches manage. We'll have you, he said. Glad of it. Trontrong, Silas. Crowder did not take Garrett's departure well. He sat at his desk that night, the ledger open in front of him, the column of figures meaning less than it ever had. Because the number that mattered wasn't written down anywhere. 11 years. He'd known Garrett longer than he'd known most members of his own family still living. Garrett had taught him to ride before his father got impatient and hired a proper instructor. Garrett had stood at the back of his mother's funeral, hat in hand, the only one of the staff who'd cried. And he'd let him walk for the price of one stubborn principle. Silas poured the whiskey, didn't touch it. Just sat there in the lamplight, alone in a house built for a family he'd never managed to fill it with, listening to the particular silence of a place with one less person in it than it had carried that morning. He thought of his father, thought of him often lately, more than he wanted to admit, the old man's voice still sharp in his memory even years after the funeral. Soft, his father used to call him. Too soft for ranching, too soft for business, needs somebody smaller around him to feel like a man at all. He'd spent his life trying to prove that voice wrong. And somehow, in trying, he'd become exactly the kind of man his father would have approved of. Cruel in small, calculated ways, desperate to make somebody else feel smaller so he could. Feel, for just a moment, like he wasn't a man who measured loyalty in wages instead of years, a man who'd just lost 11 of them over a fence. He pushed the whiskey aside, untouched, and sat a long while in the quiet, listening to a house that had never before felt this much like an empty room. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later, not in a courtroom, not with guns, but in the simplest way these things sometimes resolve themselves, in broad daylight on the very strip of disputed land that had started it all. Cora was checking the mended fence line when she saw him riding toward her, alone, no ranch hands flanking him this time, just Silas Crowder. Looking older than he had 4 months ago, the easy confidence worn thin at the edges. Miss Hendricks, Mr. Crowder, he dismounted, stood there a moment, hat in hand, looking somehow smaller than the man who'd sneered at her across a train platform back in August. I came to say something, he said. Don't quite know how to say it proper, so I'll just say it plain. Plain works. The council ruling stands. I'm not contesting it further. He looked out over the grazing land, anywhere but directly at her. And I'm not sending anyone back to cut your fences or trouble your buyers. That's finished. Why the change of heart? He was quiet a long moment. Because Garrett's gone, he said finally. Working for Holt now. I expect you know. 11 years he kept that place running, and I let him walk over a fence and a stranger's testimony. His jaw tightened. Slept in my own house last week, and it felt like sleeping in somebody else's. First time in my life I noticed how quiet a big house gets when there's nobody left in it who actually wanted to be there. Maybe he walked away over more than the fence. Silas looked at her then. Really looked. the way Nate had looked at her that first evening, except this time. It cost him something visible to do it. "You asked me something back at that meeting," he said. "Asked who actually benefits from all this. I've been turning that over since." He paused. "I think the honest answer is nobody, not me. Sure as anything, not you or Holt. I think I've spent 4 months trying to win something that was never actually a contest to begin with. What was it then?" He looked down at his hat. "My father used to say I was soft. Said it often enough. I built half my life trying to prove him wrong. Bought the biggest spread in the county. Sent for a wife I thought would make me look like the kind of man he'd have respected." His voice roughened. "Then you stepped off that train, and you were bigger than me in every way that mattered. And some old ugly part of me decided I couldn't have that. Couldn't have you proving, just by existing, that I'd been measuring everything wrong my whole life." Cora stood with that a long moment. Felt something settle in her that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't quite anger anymore either. "You spent 4 months punishing a whole ranch," she said quietly, "because I reminded you of something your own father said to you decades ago. When you put it that plain, it sounds foolish. It was foolish, Mr. Crowder. I know that now. Took losing the only person who ever told me the truth without asking permission." First, he mounted his horse, paused before riding off. "For what it's worth, I hope it works out. Whatever this is, between you and Holt. Man deserves something good after everything I've put him through." He rode off before she could answer, and Cora stood there a long while, watching him go, feeling something settle in her chest that felt, for the first time since that train platform, genuinely finished. She told Nate about it that evening, the two of them sitting on the porch steps, while the last light folded over the mountains. "He just rode up and said all that?" Nate asked. "Word for word, more or less. And you believe him?" "I believe he's tired of being the man his father made him into." She watched the sky deepen toward purple. "Doesn't mean I trust him. Just means I don't think we'll be fighting him anymore." Nate was quiet a moment. 4 months ago," he said, "I watched a man humiliate you on a train platform, and I thought, there goes a woman who'll be gone east again inside a week. Charming thing to admit. Let me finish." His voice had gone careful, the way it did when something mattered enough to choose words slowly. "Instead, you stayed, worked harder than any hand I've had. Saved my herd in a storm that should have scared you off for good. Stood in front of half this county, and told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet." He turned to look at her. "I've been trying to figure out, this whole time, how to tell you what that's meant to me, without sounding like I'm just grateful for the help. And I gave up trying to make it sound clever." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled something small, plain, a thin gold band that had clearly belonged to someone else once, years worn into the metal. "This was my mother's. I've been carrying it around 3 weeks now, trying to find the right moment. Except I don't think there's a right moment for something like this. There's just the moment you're in." Cora's breath caught, "Nate. I'm not asking because I feel sorry for what Crowder put you through, and I'm not asking because you saved my herd, or my buyers, or my pride in front of the whole county. Though you did. All 3. He held the ring steady, though his hand wasn't entirely steady doing it. "I'm asking because somewhere in these 4 months I stopped seeing you as my hired hand and started seeing you as the only person I want standing beside me at that fence line, that storm, that council meeting, every single day from now on. However many inches that takes." Cora looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at 4 months that had started with a sneer on a train platform, and somehow impossibly ended up here. "That's a far better proposal than the last man's offer," she said, voice thick. "Last man offered you train fare and an insult. He did. I'm offering considerably less money, and a ring that's seen better decades." A laugh broke loose from her, half tears, half real joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Nathaniel Holt. However many inches it takes, they married in spring. In the same church hall where Eli Marsh had once stood up to Silas Crowder in front of the whole county, where Cora had once stood and told the truth when it would have been easier not to. Martha Calloway stood as witness, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, she'd swear. Afterward, she only brought along for the dust Ellie Marsh. Considerably less skinny than he'd been 4 months before, stood proudly near the front. Having appointed himself, without asking anyone's permission, the official keeper of the rings, Garrett stood near the back, hat in his hands the way it always seemed to be, smiling the quiet smile of a man who'd finally settled an old debt in full. Even Silas Crowder sent a note. Brief. Plain wishing them well, in his own awkward way, and mentioning he'd be selling off part of his eastern acreage that spring. Land, he wrote, he'd never really needed, had only ever wanted to prove something with. Cora read it twice. Then set it aside and didn't think on it again. Some chapters simply needed closing, not carrying forward. Years later, the Holt Ranch had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. That first cold morning at 5 o'clock, with a rooster crowing like an argument, and a stranger learning her way around an unfamiliar stove. Garrett, well into his 70s now, still came out most mornings to oversee the younger hands, claiming he was too old to actually work, and then working anyway. Eli Marsh. Grown into a steady young man, worked the spread alongside them most seasons, having long since outgrown the boys who'd once mocked his size. It was Eli, in fact, who came riding up the lane one autumn afternoon, with a boy trailing behind him on a borrowed pony. A thin, anxious child of about 10, clearly new to the saddle, clearly trying very hard not to look as scared as he felt. Cora, Eli swung down, the easy confidence of a grown man who remembered, clearly, what it had cost him to find that confidence in the first place. This is Daniel. Lives over past the Rivers place. Boys at school have been giving him a hard time. Cora studied the boy a moment, recognized something in the set of his shoulders, the way he kept his eyes down, the careful, practiced smallness of someone trying not to be noticed. Giving you trouble for what, Daniel? The boy's voice came out barely above a whisper. They say I talk funny. On account of my stammer, Cora crouched down, which still put her near eye level with most grown men, let alone a boy of 10. You know what they used to call me when I was younger than you? He shook his head. Giant. Said it plenty of times, plenty of places. Like it was the only thing worth knowing about me. She held out a hand, the same rough, calloused hand that had once wrestled 40 head of a cattle through a lightning storm. Took me a long while to learn it wasn't the only thing worth knowing. Wasn't even the most important thing. You want to learn how I figured that out? Daniel looked at Eli, who nodded encouragingly. Then back at Cora. Yes. Ma'am. Good, she stood, dusting off her hands. First thing you learn out here is that standing your ground isn't about how loud your voice is. It's about whether you mean what you're standing for. Come on. I'll show you how we settle a nervous horse before he settles you instead. She led him toward the corral, Eli falling into step beside her, and for a moment she caught Nate watching from the porch, a faint smile on his face, the particular look of a man who'd long since stopped being surprised by what his wife chose to do with her Tuesday afternoons. That evening, after Daniel had gone home with considerably less stammer in his voice and considerably more steadiness in his shoulders, Cora found herself sitting on the porch steps beside Nate, watching the last light fold gold over land that had once been contested, fought over, nearly lost. His hand found hers the same steady way it always had. "You're going to end up running a school out of that corral," he said. "Could be worse things to run, could be." He was quiet a moment, watching the sun drop behind Storm Peak. "You ever think about that train platform? August, all those years back. More than I used to. Less than I expected to." By now, she watched a hawk circle once over the eastern pasture before banking away toward the mountains. "I think about the word mostly, giant. Used to feel like an accusation, something I had to apologize my way around. And now?" She turned the word over slowly, the way she might once have turned over a stone to see what lived underneath it. "Now I think it just meant I was always going to need a life big enough to hold everything I had in me. Took the wrong man's cruelty and the right man's patience to teach me that. Took a boy standing up in a dance hall and an old man choosing a debt over a wage, and a frightened child this very afternoon, looking at me like maybe his own size. Whatever shape that trouble takes doesn't have to be the end of his story either." Nate squeezed her hand. "Not too big," he said quietly. "Just exactly enough. Simply enough." Cora agreed and leaned her head against his shoulder as the last light went purple over the mountains. The ranch settling into evening sounds around them. Cattle calling somewhere in the dark. The creek running full and unbothered along the eastern line. A life built not on what the world had decided she should be, but on what she'd chosen every single day since that train platform to become instead.